So we are going to have our next speaker. Let me introduce him. Sorry, my Zoom decided to be a little bit lagging. Okay, so I'm going to introduce our next speaker, Alexanda Whitcombe. Alexanda is an Indigenous practitioner and an innovation strategist from Aotearoa, New Zealand. He works with the design and innovation in community development, regenerative urban environments, social enterprise sector, and digital technologies. Alexanda is passionate about working toward intergenerational well-being and, in particular, unlocking the collective future of Aotearoa, New Zealand. His talk will focus on working within ecosystems and asking the question, who are we designing for? Welcome, Alexanda.
Kia ora. It's an honor to be here. Today I'll be talking about Wairua-Centred design. Ko reo pau tōku maunga, ko wanganui tōku awa, ko te ati haunui e paparangi rawa ko Naururu ki tahi o ki iwi, ko no Pukikoui he tūranga waiwai, ko Alexanda Whitcombe tōku ingoa. Just want to take the opportunity to introduce myself. So in Te Reo Māori and the Māori worldview, it's really important when we talk about the genealogy and whakapapa that we acknowledge our ancestral mountain, which is referenced in this photo here, the Ruapehu, followed by your river, your ancestral river, which is Wanganui for me, my tribal affiliations, then followed by your chiefly leader, further down to your name of your family group, to your parents, and then lastly, you reference yourself. So you're a direct result of those who came before you. So it's important that I mention that to give us context for today's presentation. So again, my name is Alexanda Whitcombe. I use the pronouns of he, him. I'm from Aotearoa, New Zealand, the Southern Hemisphere. It's an honor to be here today. I have heritage to the Māori people, which is the Indigenous native people of New Zealand. And again, thank you for your time. So this we call a whakatauki, a proverb, which I think kind of centers a lot of my practice. E noho taure mai, ka tū taure atu. Remain a student until you become the example. So a little bit about myself. I've spent the last 10 years in the discipline of design, service design, product design. And in this journey, I've actually learned that I'm becoming a recovering product designer, industrial designer. And more importantly, in the last 5 years, I've had the opportunity and the privilege to serve my community in Auckland, where I'm from. And through that journey, I've had that chance to reconnect to my heritage, reclaim part of the language, the traditions, the protocols. And what I've learned the most in that time is actually unlearning a lot of the discipline that I've acquired over those years. And through that time, I've been able to learn from a lot of our traditional elders. One in particular, his name is Matura Ririata Makiha, who can recite 1,000 years of traditional knowledge back to one of our first ancestors that arrived here in Aotearoa. So that's kind of really shaped my paradigm and my thinking. It's really helped understand my responsibility, my privilege, and what it means to serve as a designer, which leads to this next point here.
Alex, I'm so sorry to interrupt. If you have a slide deck, we can't see it. So can you do a share screen?
Apologies. So just referencing the first picture, I mentioned my ancestral mountain, which is the Ruapehu, following by a proverb that I mentioned just recently around remain a student until you become the example. And so again, kind of unlearning a lot of that practice, which has led me to this diagram here, which you can see, which may be familiar to some people. On the left, you've got a triangle image, the hierarchical structure, ego-centered perspective, and on the right side, you've got an ecological diagram of circular thinking. So if we can kind of contextualize the current paradigm, which we're being predominantly using at this point in time, is human focused, with humans at the top of the hierarchical structure. And what we end up doing is designing for human need. And what comes packed with that is human entitlement. So you can see that kind of representation of people at the top. And when you translate it into design practice, it becomes around extracting knowledge, extracting information, whether it be your clients, whether it be the environment, and you're packaging that up into a product and a service and selling it back to that person. And so you can see that really transactional relationship, that real huge dominance around people. If you look onto the right side, you see the ecological circle, where you see a state of harmony, a state of balance. You see people in relationship, interconnected relationship to the wider ecosystem. And so the importance of that is you start to change the paradigm from a human structure, which is quite finite, and you start to explore a larger ecosystem with many paradigms and many interconnected layers. And so that's the premise of Wairua-centred thinking. So Wairua-centred thinking in the Māori worldview loosely translates to spirituality. It moves, again, talking the paradigm of balance, so working in synchronicity with the natural ecological environments, the natural signs and the patterns. It allows you to kind of hold that paradigm and thinking around 7 generational thinking, so the 3 that came before you and the 3 to follow. And so, and from a Te Ao Māori worldview, the word Wairua also translates through into the kind of spiritual realm. So it talks about the unseen, the unheard voices, the unseen voices of your children, your children's children that are yet to come. It also talks about your ancestors who have passed on, and the undetected presence of, say, the wind has on the natural environment. So you take into this consideration all of those environmental factors. So this is another proverb, whātu ngaro aro, he tangata tuitu, he whenua. So when people disappear, the land remains. And I think that kind of symbolizes the paradigm and the approach to design. So what I'm going to try to do is share an application of what that looks like in practice. So this is a geological overview of a region where I'm from. And you can kind of see the physical infrastructure in the image, and you can also see kind of parts of the environmental infrastructure. And the importance to showcase here is to give some context. So you've got tribal affiliations from many parts of the country. You've got people migrating from other areas, rural regions, to come to this urban city. You start to see the built environment start to take place and take over a lot of the natural landscape, which is fresh, rich, fertile soil. In the middle here, you might be able to see with the cursor, there's 2 ancestral mountains. One here, as I mentioned earlier, is your ancestor, and so you can liken that to your great-great-great-great-grandfather, for example. And if you can imagine if that was to be quarried away, cut down, and become the roads for that city, you can imagine that kind of sense of loss, sense of sadness and disconnection. And so you've got those kind of cultural complexities that you need to consider. And I guess another reference is if you imagine a church, your place of worship, a sacred place. If that church was taken away and each brick was used to create a footpath, it kind of gives you that detail of how that how it affects your cultural and spiritual connection. And so to add more complexity to that, now that that mountain's been quarried away, it also has 3 of the largest prisons in the country, and that's housing a lot of the indigenous population of this region. So this region particularly has the largest Māori population. So it kind of gives you an overview of the context of, I guess, some of the traditional paradigms that we're looking at. And what I'm going to do now is try give you a sense of how you can slowly nudge and change that paradigm and the way that we look at the conditions of design. So one area of that larger geographical area, there's a park. So this is its current state. As you can see on the left, it's a picture of a small lake, a pond. You can see it's quite polluted, very still water, which gives you a sense that it's a still dead body of water. What we call the life force around Wairua is very low. It's very dormant, and you can kind of see how it's been treated and neglected. And so if we take a business as usual approach with traditional design, you often see a similar structure on the right, which is a very, I guess, manufactured infrastructure design that you could probably see in most places in the world. And it's a starting point for creating new places. But what I'd like to give you an example is, which is next, is if we're able to look at creating the conditions to serve a new narrative. So on the current state on the left, and then in the middle is a couple of diagrams to show an alternative approach, which we've been exploring. So what happens when you put a Māori knowledge system or Indigenous knowledge system at the center of your thinking, how the values and the philosophy plays out in the design process. So you can see that you're workshopping with community, you're given the opportunity to share the power dynamic, resource, and decision-making ability. In the middle, where the cursor is us talking back to our elders to be guided around concepts that will be suitable for that natural landscape, given the genealogy of the area. So being guided by that practice, then referencing symbolism, markers, artifacts of that time, recent times, and they're connected to that body of water. And then translating that into a structure using our local suppliers and empowering them to be part of the process. So this gives you an idea of how you might be able to nudge that practice to be more localized, indigenized from left to right. So this particular design was focused on how do you move away from just having physical spaces that are just used for high intensity activity, or be completely neglected. That's how parks are usually used. These young people in community wanted to create a safe space of sanctuary, a place that will help the natural wildlife return, playing the sounds of birds, creating a quiet space, having acoustic music, empowering the community to be part of that solution. Secondly, this is a very similar project close by to that park. There's an ancestral river, and the picture on the left there is the pollution in that stream. You've got a trolley, some debris, and I guess what we can't see, it doesn't quite tell you the full story, but again, going back to that story of the place, there's a lot of intergenerational trauma. There's high transient housing, communities being displaced, and a lot of the infrastructure of the housing faces the road and neglects the mainstream, which is a real shame. And so you can see that current state with the line infrastructure, built environment has kind of got rid of the natural ecology in the landscape, and the river is now running straight, which damages a lot of the the biodiversity and marine life. And again, trying to provide an alternative approach to change those conditions with a Wairua-Centred approach. We used a similar practice, but the opportunity we saw a few years ago was to replace a 6-kilometre walk with the ability of those families to actually connect to the story of the place. So you've got families that have been there for 20, 50, perhaps even longer years, and not have any association or connection to the land that where they're living. And so we saw the opportunity to embed cultural stories and knowledge, but also digital technology. So we reframed the whole event from walking for physical activity, but moving it to a Te Ao Māori worldview perspective of pursuit of knowledge. So using technology and time markers, which you see in the middle there of how to play, little icons where kids can download an app on their phone, walk a kilometre, look for a certain marker of that place, whether it be a local eel, which is a marine life, a symbol of one of the core vegetables of that time, also of the local mountain. So being able to scan that icon, hear that story, put it on their phone, and locate it for another time to share with their family. And so that's gone to evolve into many iterations where now kids have a bit of a sense of connection to the river, a sense of pride into their heritage. So these are two examples of the application of what Wairua-centred thinking could look like in practice. And what I want to really refer to as we come to a close is just having the opportunity to, as designers, as service designers, really think about the role, the privilege and the responsibility that you have to serve and predict the future. As a designer, I've realized hold a really strong position in shaping and predicting the future as designers, as innovators. And so what I've learned is kind of twofold, is being of service. So learning how to serve and how you can use your role to serve your community, but something much larger than yourself. And then really thinking about what are those conditions, principles that you can change to serve the outcome of those people. And so, for example, working with Māori communities, if I use the traditional design approach using post-it notes and pens, I've already disconnected them from the process. They already feel alienated by that process. So what I've learned in my practice is that I don't want to recolonize my community in that way. So how can I walk alongside my elders to understand that paradigm, to change my practice, to then enable people to participate and be part of the solution. So this diagram here is the waka tūrua, which is a symbol of two canoes, two boats, and in the middle we've got a papa noho or kaupapa, which is generally the binding connection between two worldviews, if you can liken it to. So you've got the Te Ao Māori worldview, and you've got Tauiwi, and alternative worldviews. And so it's about finding that bridge, and really that's where I've been spending my time, is to try and find that bridge around how do we journey together to learn from each other. And what we find in a lot of our Indigenous practices is we've lost that innate sense of connection to those time markers, to the survival mechanisms. So when we think about sustainability, how do we allow that opportunity for people to share their practice? So before I move to my last slide, is really owning that role as a designer, unpacking that practice, doing what you can to change those conditions and change the narrative. And before I move on to when I start to think about 7 generations of thinking, you start to think about what your ancestors did before you. What are the challenges, quests that they've embarked on, and what do they leave behind for you to continue that journey? And then lastly, thinking about, for myself, what challenges and quests do I want to start upon to leave the next generation to continue. Which brings me to my last slide, is as you start to think about your practice as a designer, as a change maker, really consider these two questions. Who are you designing for? And how can you be a good ancestor? Nō reira, e aku rangatira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you for your time. And that concludes my presentation.
Thank you so much. Oh my goodness, thank you for that absolutely beautiful talk. I'm following along with the chat in the Brella app, in kind of the real-time chat, and everyone is loving it. And someone said, it's really bringing me to tears a bit, and I will admit the same as well. It's such a beautiful kind of context to stop and consider. I think it's so life affirming to think about our greater connection almost at this higher level before we get into any of the work. So I think we thank you for that perspective.